Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the Decolonising Development podcast. Today, I am joined in the studio for an interview with Professor Oliver Craig, Professor of Archaeological Science at the University of York. He is also Director of BioArCh, one of Europe's largest and most respected centres for bioarchaeological research. I began by asking Professor Craig, what is bioarchaeology?
All right, thanks. Great to talk to you today. Bioarchaeology is the study of biological remains from the past. So that can be anything from ancient plant remains, ancient animal remains, ancient human remains, but it also encompasses quite a wide range of archaeological science. So from the study of perhaps organic residues on pottery, the kind of foods that people leave on the pottery, to analysing people's diets, to their ancestry through analysis of bones, and also to a whole wider range of anything that's biological that remains from ancient times.
That sounds fascinating. Thank you very much. And that leads me on to ask that a key theme of decolonial research is transdisciplinarity, collaborating across specialisms to get more comprehensive answers to big questions. Professor Craig, do you recognise transdisciplinarity in your own work, and if so, where?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, my background is as a scientist. I was trained as a biochemist and geneticist, and then I came into the field of archaeology in the 1990s. And at that point, archaeology was largely, I guess, cultural archaeology. So it was quite an arts and humanities-driven discipline. There was a lot of archaeological science. People have been radiocarbon dating things for a long time, obviously, studying remains of people in the past and animals and plants in the past. But there was a great opportunity in the 90s to kind of merge the emerging disciplines in biological sciences with archaeology. And you can see straight away that that creates this real new field where these two disciplines are really coming together. And it's quite a really exciting area. Initially, it was very much two disciplines. So you had biologists or chemists working in their labs, had archaeologists working in the departments, and they would transfer samples between each other and have conversations to work it out. But now the field has come much closer together, and we have these methods embedded in an archaeological discipline.
I wonder, have you ever drawn on theory or concepts from other disciplines, as well as doing the very practical transdisciplinary work?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so as I said, initially we were, set up out as biologists or chemists working very much within our own disciplines, but we kind of lack the questions or the kind of theoretical tools really to really deeply analyze the data or even ask the right questions. So what was really needed, and this came in the early 2000s, was training scientists, people with the kind of background in chemistry and biological sciences in the discipline of archaeology, so they were able to ask the right questions of the materials that they were analysing. And I think that's happened quite successfully, at least in Western contexts.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. As you say, asking the questions is always, the important starting point, and different perspectives can help us do that. Can you give us any examples of where this type of collaboration has helped to fill in the gaps of archaeology, or vice versa, whereas archaeology has filled in the gaps of history, science, etc.?
Yeah. Perhaps the most famous example would be the application of ancient DNA. So this is the extraction of DNA from human or animal remains. So the technology for doing that was developed in the 70s and 80s. It's been widely applied in the biological sciences. The Human Genome Project is very well known. But it was only really in the 90s when people realized they could start using that information and adapting it to answer archaeological questions. And that suddenly allowed archaeologists to look at questions such as migration, which is obviously a big issue in archaeology. The movement of material culture, was that driven by the movement of ideas, which was a very popular theory at the time, or was it actually moved by migrating people? We could actually approach that question and answer it using DNA technologies.
Fascinating to think, what these things can discover, what's already been discovered. You've touched on a lot of strengths of, working across disciplines and bringing these ideas together. Are there any, dare I say, difficulties or challenges of transdisciplinary research that you've come across?
Yeah, huge challenges, because armed with that kind of new technique, that new methodology, and that expertise allows us to really try and open up a load of Pandora's boxes, questions that couldn't be answered before. Now, obviously, that's going to resonate to some degree with archaeologists who are working in that area, but also it's naturally going to lead to a little bit of conflict.
Right.
Because people who maybe have quite long-standing theories now are able to actually test them in a perhaps more rigorous way, and the results that they're getting sometimes were kind of interpreted in a very kind of basic way. They weren't really given the kind of a nuance that perhaps they could have done with greater knowledge of the context for where the samples, for example, were coming from. And this has caused a lot of kind of, a little bit of trouble in actually getting this research through and agreed by both sides of the argument. But as I say, things have really come on now, and there is a lot more consensus in the way that we should be using some of these technologies.
Okay, that's really fascinating. And because something that this project wants to sort of engage with is the difficulties, the challenges, the reality of doing decolonizing work or using the methodologies that you use and working across disciplines. So it's really interesting to think about some of the challenges. How do you think, that kind of those issues, those obstacles, how have you sort of managed to overcome them or tackle them or just work through them?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it's really been really important to involve both sides. So basically, I've trained as an archaeologist, so I've come from a genetic side, but I've also trained partly as an archaeologist as well. And I've interacted with archaeologists to try and pose those questions and then be able to answer them. So it's centering the expertise, which is transdisciplinary, within one group or people are working very closely together. And so the field has actually morphed together. So people are no longer, working in their own separate disciplines, but they've come together and they have knowledge of both the archaeological context, but also the methods that can be applied. However, I would say that this is quite restricted to certain areas. I mean, we're not seeing this across the board at the moment.
Okay.
And particularly when you go to a global context, this is where some of the issues start to rear their head.
Okay, I see. It's interesting what you say about, these things have to develop gradually almost over time, don't they? You can't force things. Yeah. People need to come to them themselves through training, through being, open and dialogue, I suppose, is so important. As well as transcending disciplines, a lot of your research also cuts across countries. For our listeners less familiar with your work, could you explain or give a flavour of some of the different places your work has taken you to?
Yeah. So basically, I'm interested in prehistory. So I worked, before the Rickon record. So concepts of national boundaries don't really resonate very much with my research and our group's research. But we have themes that run through our research. So one of those big themes is what happens when agriculture arrives, for example.
Okay.
And so that theme can be applied globally. Obviously, agriculture arrived in different places at different times. There's centres for crop domestication around the world. So we see an opportunity for taking some of those themes that perhaps have developed, say, in Europe and moving to different parts of the world. So we've been working in Central America or, for example, in Japan. We've done a little bit of work in Africa. So, these kind of general themes, we've kind of looked around the world to try and answer the same kind of questions. So pretty global. I've done a lot of work in Russia, a lot of work in Northern Europe as well. So it's fairly global.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know that you don't necessarily call your work decolonial, but some of what you do certainly touches on some of the themes of this project. And what I wanted to ask you about was the idea of partnerships, specifically partnerships between the global north and researchers or communities in the global south. Have you ever engaged in that kind of partnership? And if so, where and when? Yeah.
So many occasions. So, for example, we've had projects in India and just stepping back a little bit, I think that one of the issues is that the expertise for doing some of the methodology, some of the biological science that we're doing is actually, it's held with relatively few institutions. So this is fundamentally the problem. We get research that's instigated by people in the global south from time to time. So people will contact us and say, we've read your papers, we're interested in applying it to our local material. More often than not, though, it is people who are based in the global north who are looking to apply these methodologies with partners in the global south.
Okay.
And you can see there that there can be some kind of conflicts between our partners in the global south and the people who are instigating the research in the global north.
Okay, what kind of conflicts would that lead to, do you think?
Sometimes the questions that are posed are perhaps rather not very well informed with our Global South partners. Sometimes the questions are already posed and the research is actually undergoing, and it's just really an exercise in trying to sample. So I would say that people start with a very, very good intention. So when it's going back to how you think research is actually created in the first place.
Right.
So research is created in the first place by ideas that people are talking about, and then it's put into practice.
Sure.
And it's that first kind of steps, those first intentions, which is something like, wouldn't it be really cool to play it in this context? We can do this here. Why can't we do it there? Let's contact some people over there to see whether we could get the samples.
Right.
Let's progress from that point of view. And those good intentions often can lead to unforeseen consequences. For example, if we're not thinking about what the consequences of the research are. And I do believe that we're all guilty of this, I'm very guilty of this as well, is not thinking through the final kind of products of the research.
Right.
So it is the papers that come out, it's instigated by partners in the global north, but what are the other implications of that research? What about ownership and things like that? So that debate really needs to, it started to happen, but it really needs to kind of be thought about at a very early stage when instigating the research.
That's really fascinating, and that's a lot of what this project wants to engage with, particularly through, we're addressing three key themes, really, the idea of partnerships, methodology, and impact, and you've sort of touched on all of those. So if I could briefly get you to sort of focus on each one, but particularly partnerships and impact, as you just said, how do you think people in archaeology can engage people in the Global South in a more equitable way, rather than, as you say, going to them just so that they can get the samples to test their own ideas and their own theories?
Well, I mean, one of the ways we can definitely do that is by upskilling people. And the technologies that we do hold, the expertise and technology we have, say, in the Global North, and I would say it's only in very few places in the Global North. Quite often it's very concentrated in a very few laboratories. A lot of them in Europe. Europe's very strong in the area of bioarchaeology. But what we really need to do is to kind of give that expertise and upskill people who are working in different contexts. And we can do that by creating partnerships where people can move, they can be trained, that we can upskilled. We can look at setting up centres in different parts of the world and spreading that expertise a bit more globally. And there are challenges to that. Obviously, it involves time, investment, money. It involves also those facilities being available in the different places. But I think if we can actually upskill archaeologists who have the questions, the local archaeologists who are working in the Global South, who are aware of the material, perhaps it's museum curators, it's scientists working in museums located around the world. If they have knowledge and they're able to apply some of the methods that we're using, then they will be, they're very capable of asking a lot more nuanced questions and really accelerating the research much further than we could originally envisage.
One slightly awkward question, if I may, is how receptive are Global North institutions like universities here in Europe and the UK to upskilling colleagues, increasing participation from colleagues in the Global South in research processes? Because as you suggested, that does take time, it takes money. Are they receptive? And also funders, are funding institutions?
Well, that's a very good point. There's 2 points there you're making, right? I think people are receptive. People realise they need to do it, right?
Okay.
And there are institutions who do things like, summer schools or training, so they can bring people in. It does cost a lot of money. And I guess the problem is just a lack of resources. We're just not able to perhaps, bring everyone we want to across, to train, to instill that. And I think one of the problems is it's if it could be more stipulated in some of the grant applications. So if we have partnerships in grant applications, so we're encouraged to work with partners around the world in formulating the projects, to liaise with them, to definitely disseminate results to these areas. And this is really important. But there isn't very much about actually the consequences of actually upskilling local researchers in some of the techniques that you're using.
Right.
And so I wonder whether that kind of participatory approach to doing the research could be emphasized a little bit more in some of the applications.
Okay, and do you see, when we're thinking about, applications and, arguing in favor of this, do you see great mutual benefit? So obviously, researchers in the Global South partners, they're getting upskilling, their voice is being heard, their perspectives. What could we argue is the benefit for institutions and researchers in the Global North? You've mentioned asking the right questions. Are there any others that you can think of that are mutually beneficial?
Yeah, because for continued partnerships, if you could establish these more equitable relationships, you could then have the research coming another way. So basically, research who are based in the Global South, who are very aware of the local context, they're aware of the materials that are available to them, they're aware of the questions, and they're aware now of the actual research potential that what you can do. They can then start to feed in. They could start to create some of these research ideas, these research goals, and working with you, maybe still help to kind of develop them and bring those online. So you can just see immense. And we've seen it. We have actually seen this happening. Okay, it's not a Global South partnership, but this is with working with colleagues in Japan, for example, where certain methods were not very well established before. We've had Marie Curie training schemes where it allows fellows to come over, learn techniques, pick up ideas, obtain the training, return to the home country, set up labs, and then continue with collaborations going forwards, which have really brought massive benefits.
That's amazing. So the benefits on both sides seem really, really persuasive, and it's something we should definitely be investing in time and money and thought. What are some potentially obstacles to this kind of participation?
Yeah, I mean, there's many obstacles. I mean, there's obviously the distance.
Sure.
There's cultural differences. There's language differences. I think we underestimate language difference as a major issue. So like working with countries in East Asia, 3 or 4 languages you need to master there. Cultural differences as well can be quite hard to kind of break into.
Okay.
And I think it's really important to make those visits, develop those relationships, but all that takes time.
Yeah.
How do we, and perhaps a bigger question is, how do we engage with this international research agenda, which I think is really important.
Okay.
It allows our research to get out there whilst trying not to, to reduce our carbon footprint, deal with the climate emergency, not travel so much.
Yeah.
So how do we internationalize when we're meant to be working on more local scales?
Yeah.
And this is, I think, a big issue as well that needs to be dealt with.
Earlier, you mentioned what can the research do? What is the outcome? What is the product? Obviously, recently in the UK, there's been a lot of focus on impact, beyond academia, but most of that is still focused in the UK or the UK community. Have you ever given thought to how your research can impact the communities where it happens?
Yeah. You talk about a non-academic impact. There's also academic impact. I mean, I think that's kind of forgotten in local countries, right? So whether that is, and we've tried to do that as much as we can, which is to write articles in local language journals, which I think is really important. It's kind of undervalued.
Absolutely.
It's not really within our remit. We can't quite often not submit those to the REF, to our research exercises, but it is important to do. So that obviously increases exposure within the local country. And that's really important. Other areas, I guess, and we work a lot with museums. So obviously we're working with samples that are coming from different parts of the world. So we're engaging with museums in those places. So what can we give back to those museums? So these could be vectors for disseminating some of the outputs for the research. So I think it's really important to gauge with the local, even the small local museums. There's national museums as well, but there's smaller local museums.
Absolutely, yeah.
So disseminating your findings. So we analyze some bones, we analyze some pottery. What have we found? What's the story that we're trying to tell? We can give the results. We can explain that to the museum curators, and then they can do their own interpretation and present that to the local public in those areas. So that's a great opportunity to do that.
Absolutely, it's amazing. And then giving the product back, and then sort of almost leaving it in their hands to do what they want.
Yeah,
with,
exactly.
Basically.
That's engaging the public, right? I mean, and that's
Definitely.
one of the things that, as in archaeology, we're really keen to do.
Yeah.
But obviously, what the public we can reach from sitting in York is rather limited. So we really need to work with those international partners to disseminate more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just briefly on the theme of museums, recently there's been a lot of controversy about the link between colonialism and archaeology, with archaeologists in the past, like Carter, being reframed as sort of pillaging pirates, stealing artifacts, and Western museums are then criticized for hoarding them rather than just curating. People will think of the Benin bronzes, Rosetta Stone, etc. So do you think that archaeology as a field, broadly speaking, has something of a responsibility to face up to this sort of its role in colonialism in the past? Can it almost make amends, and how can it do this?
Yeah, I mean, of course it has. I mean, there's not many archaeologists who would disagree with that. I mean, we of course, what's happened in the past has happened in a colonial context quite often, and we do need to face up to that. We need to deal with that. We have to tackle it head on. And, without going too much into the politics of this and cutting it back to kind of my area, which is archaeological science, we're taking samples, but we're also taking biological material from the past. And that biological material, who does that belong to? If we're extracting DNA from bones and we keep the extracts, we've got responsibility to curate that? Do we need to give that information back to the museums? I mean, one thing that we really need to do is to make sure that all our raw data, everything that we've analysed, is reusable and available for the people who provided the samples in the first place. So it's giving that information at least back to the local countries. If we're working with museums, say, based in Britain, on materials that have been obtained from other places in the world, that raises another set of issues that needs to be dealt with. And the way that we will deal with that is to work with the local curators at the British museums. So, for example, the British Museum would be a good example, or the Natural History Museum, or other national museums. And we would work through their ethics policy very carefully. But it is really, really been informed by the people at the museums who are very on top of the kind of ethical responsibility for working with these remains.
Right, so institutions like the British Museum are developing ethics, or they have ethics guidelines,
yes,
do
of course,
they?
Yeah, they have ethics guidance. For anything, so anything that has to be lent or borrowed, we would need to go through clearances on that. And we'd also have to run that through our local ethics committee here at the University of York as well. And every university would have the same.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's amazing. And it seems that, much of your work and the way you go about it and the way you speak about it speaks to many of the themes of this project, though I appreciate, not everybody labels them decolonial. And usually this topic is dominated by development studies with some input from history and the humanities. So hearing about the perspectives and experience of archaeology has generally been really illuminating. So we thank you very, very much. And if there's anything else you wanted to say about archaeology and decolonising, that'd be great.
No, I think it's really interesting. And I think, these are the kind of discussions that we need to have. Mm-hmm. And it's a great opportunity to talk about it with you. And it'd be really interesting to get other people's perspective, people working outside the field, on kind of the practices within the kind of archaeological sciences.
Yeah.
And just opening up that debate more broadly, not only to academic circles, but also to the public as well, I think is really important. So I'll be very interested to see the outcome of this project and how it goes.
Wonderful. That's amazing. So here's to more future discussions. Professor Craig, thank you very, very much for speaking to me.
Thank you very much.